Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones we can see, but the ones that live in our hearts long after we think they've healed. The loss of someone we love changes us forever, but what happens when that loss reveals a truth we never saw coming? When the mighty Viking warrior Halvard returned to his brother's grave, he expected only memories and silence. Instead, he found a young woman named Alfrid weeping beside the burial stone. Her 3 simple words would change everything. "I carry his child." This hardened warrior, shaped by years of battle and loss, suddenly faced a choice that had nothing to do with sword or shield. Would he turn away from this stranger's claim? Or would he become the protector that his brother's unborn child desperately needed? This is the story of how grief can become hope, how duty can transform into love, and how sometimes our greatest strength comes not from fighting, but from choosing to care for those who need us most. But would the clan accept this mysterious woman? And could Halvard shield both mother and child from the dangers that threatened them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and Halvard stood at the edge of the burial field where generations of his kin lay beneath moss-covered stones. In his weathered hands he held Sorrowbiter, the war axe that had belonged to his father, and his father's father before him. The ancient weapon's handle was worn smooth by countless grips, its iron head bearing the scars of battles fought in distant lands and forgotten wars. Today, like every morning for the past year, he had come to speak with his brother. The stone-ringed village of Jordvik spread behind him like a sleeping beast, its wooden halls and smoking hearths nestled between the towering peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. This was the land of his fathers, where the old ways still held sway, and a man's worth was measured not by gold, but by the strength of his sword arm and the honor of his word. Here, among the windswept graves and ancient rune stones, Halvard felt the weight of all those who had come before him. "Brother," he whispered to the moss-covered stone that marked Einar's resting place, "another season passes, and still I carry the burden you left behind." Einar's grave was marked by a stone taller than most, carved with runes that spoke of his courage and the manner of his death. At its base, Halvard had placed a collection of small offerings over the months, polished stones from the shore where they had played as children, a piece of amber that caught the light like captured sunfire, and always fresh pine boughs that filled the air with the scent of the deep forest. The memory came to him, as it always did, unbidden and sharp as a blade between the ribs. 1 year ago, Einar had stood in this very spot, his sea-green eyes bright with the prospect of adventure. At 28 winters, he had been in the prime of his strength, his golden beard braided with silver rings that caught the light when he laughed. The raid to the Orkney Islands had promised rich plunder and greater glory, and Einar had been eager to prove himself worthy of the songs that would be sung around winter fires. "The ravens call, brother," Einar had said that last morning, adjusting the leather straps of his mail shirt. "Can you not hear them? They sing of deeds yet undone, of treasures waiting beyond the horizon." Halvard had felt the familiar knot of worry in his chest, the same feeling that had plagued him since they were boys, and Einar would venture too far into the dark woods or climb too high among the treacherous cliff faces. "The ravens call for many things, brother. Not all of their songs end in glory." But Einar had only laughed, that carefree sound that could lift the spirits of the entire hall. "You worry like an old woman, Halvard. I am not some untested youth. Have I not sailed the whale road before? Have I not stood in the shield wall and felt the kiss of iron? The conversation had continued as they walked through the village, past the workshops where smiths hammered red-hot iron, and the women wove cloth on their looms. Elder Bjorn had been sitting outside the great hall that morning, his ancient face creased with the wisdom of 80 winters, his blind eyes still sharp enough to see the hearts of men. "Young Einar," the old man had called out, his voice carrying the authority of one who had counselled jarls and kings. "Come here, boy. Let these old hands feel the measure of you." Einar had approached with the easy confidence that marked him, kneeling before the elder, as custom demanded. Bjorn's gnarled fingers had traced the lines of Einar's face, feeling the strength in his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders. "Strong as an oak," the elder had pronounced, "but beware the storm that breaks even the mightiest tree. The sea does not care for your courage, young wolf. She takes what she will and gives back only what pleases her." The warning had proven prophetic. 3 months into the voyage, word had come back with a surviving ship. A storm had scattered the raiding fleet, and Einar's vessel had been driven onto the rocks of a nameless island. Some had drowned in the churning waters, others had died fighting the local defenders who had come like angry wasps to protect their hive. Einar had fallen with an enemy spear through his heart, his body lost to the hungry sea. The news had arrived with the autumn winds, carried by a one-eyed warrior named Thorkel, who had served alongside Einar. Halvard remembered every detail of that moment. The way Thorkel had limped into the hall, his left arm bound in blood-stained cloth, the silence that had fallen over the gathered warriors like a shroud. "Your brother died well," Thorkel had said, his voice rough as grinding stone. "He saved 5 men from the surf before the spear found him. The skalds will sing of his courage when the winter nights grow long." But songs could not fill the empty place at the high table, could not warm the bed that grew cold without a brother's easy laugh. Halvard had inherited not just sorrow-biter, but the responsibility of protecting what Einar had left behind, their sister Astrid, their aging parents, and the portion of the village that looked to their family for guidance. Astrid had taken the news with the stoic grace of a woman born to the Viking way. But Halvard had seen the tears she thought no one noticed, had heard her weeping in the dark hours before dawn. She was 26 now, unmarried by choice, her auburn hair still bright despite the silver threads that grief had woven through it. She managed their household with quiet efficiency, but the light had gone out of her eyes when word of Einar's death had reached them. "She blames herself," their mother Ingrid had confided to Halvard one evening as they sat by the fire. "She thinks she should have talked him out of going, should have seen some sign in the bones she casts, or the flight of the ravens." Their father, Magnus, had said little about the loss. The old warrior had simply grown quieter, spending long hours staring out at the fjord where Einar's ship had last been seen. His once powerful frame had seemed to shrink inward, as if the weight of grief was slowly crushing him from within. The village itself had felt the loss keenly. Einar had been beloved by the common folk, quick with a jest or a helping hand, always ready to listen to their troubles or share in their small joys. The children had followed him like ducklings, enchanted by his stories of distant lands and fantastic creatures. The young men had looked to him as a model of what a warrior should be, brave without being reckless, strong without being cruel. Halvard, by contrast, had always been the serious one, the brother who planned while Einar dreamed, who worried while Einar laughed. At 32 winters, he was still unmarried, still devoted to the duties that Einar had never felt bound by. Where his brother had been the bright flame that drew people close, Halvard was the steady oak that sheltered them from the storm. The difference had never mattered while Einar lived. They had complemented each other like the twin wolves of legend, each providing what the other lacked. But now, with that bright flame extinguished, Halvard felt the full weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a cloak made of iron. Elder Bjorn had spoken to him of this burden just days after the funeral. They had walked together among the burial stones, the old man's staff tapping against the frost-hardened earth as they moved through the field of the dead. A man can spend his whole life preparing for leadership, Bjorn had said, his sightless eyes somehow finding the path among the graves. But nothing truly prepares him for the moment when it falls upon his shoulders. Your brother's death was not just a loss to your family, Halvard. The village has lost its bright flame, and now they look to you to be their steady light. I am not my brother, Halvard had replied, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. I cannot be what he was to them. No, the elder had agreed. You cannot, but you can be what you were meant to be. Einar was the dreamer, the one who looked beyond the horizon and saw possibility. You are the builder, the one who makes dreams into reality. The village needs both, but now you must be enough for all. The conversation had haunted Halvard through the dark months of winter, as he struggled to fill the void his brother had left behind. He had thrown himself into his duties with grim determination, settling disputes with fair judgment, organizing the young men for training, ensuring that the village's defenses remained strong. But always, in the quiet moments, he felt the absence like a missing tooth, an empty space that nothing could fill. The seasons had turned, winter giving way to spring, and spring to summer. But the ache remained constant. Halvard had aged years in those months, the lines around his grey eyes deepening, his brown hair showing the first touches of premature silver at the temples. He had become a man shaped by duty rather than desire, his life measured out in responsibilities rather than joys. And so he came each morning to this place, to speak with his brother's stone, and remember the man who had been taken too soon. The ritual had become as much a part of him as breathing, a way of maintaining the connection that death had severed but not destroyed. Today, however, as Halvard approached the familiar grave with its moss-covered stone and scattered offerings, he sensed that something was different. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The ravens that usually cawed from the ancient pine were silent, and even the wind had stilled, as if the very elements were holding back to witness what was about to occur. It was then that he saw her, a figure kneeling beside Einar's grave, her slender form draped in a woolen cloak the color of autumn leaves. Her head was bowed in what appeared to be prayer or deep contemplation, her dark hair spilling like a waterfall across her shoulders. She was young, perhaps no more than 20 winters, with the kind of delicate beauty that spoke of noble blood and careful upbringing. But it was not her beauty that stopped Halvard in his tracks. It was the fact that she was there at all, weeping over his brother's grave, as if she had every right to do so. For a long moment, Halvard stood frozen among the burial stones, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The young woman at his brother's grave was a stranger to him, yet she wept with the kind of grief that spoke of deep intimacy, of loss that cut to the bone. Her sobs were soft but heartfelt, the sound carrying clearly in the morning stillness. She held something in her hands, a small carved wooden figure that Halvard recognized with a start. It was one of Einar's whittling projects, a tiny wolf that his brother had been working on during the long winter nights before his final voyage. Halvard had thought all such personal items had been gathered and placed with the burial goods. Yet here, this stranger held it as if it were the most precious treasure in all the 9 realms. "Who are you?" Halvard's voice came out harsher than he intended, roughened by surprise and the sudden surge of protective anger that rose in his chest. "What right have you to disturb the peace of the dead?" The young woman startled at his words, her head snapping up to reveal a face streaked with tears. Her eyes were the color of spring grass, bright and alive despite her sorrow, and they widened with something that might have been fear as she took in Halvard's imposing figure. She clutched the wooden wolf closer to her breast, as if it might shield her from his displeasure. She began, then stopped, her voice catching in her throat. She was even younger than he had first thought, perhaps no more than 19 winters, with the kind of pale beauty that spoke of a life spent away from harsh labor. Her hands, he noticed, were soft and uncalloused, marking her as someone unaccustomed to the daily toil that marked most women of their station. "Speak," Halvard commanded, taking a step closer. Sorrow Biter hung at his side, its familiar weight a comfort in this moment of confusion. "Give me your name and your purpose here, or remove yourself from this sacred ground." The young woman struggled to her feet, the woolen cloak falling back to reveal a simple but well-made dress of blue wool, cinched at the waist with a leather belt that bore silver fittings. Everything about her spoke of status and wealth, yet she was unaccompanied and clearly distressed. "My name is Alfrid," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. "Alfrid Gunnsdottir, daughter of Gunnar, the merchant from Stavanger." The name meant nothing to Halvard, but Stavanger was 3 days' ride to the south, a prosperous trading town that dealt in amber and furs. That explained her fine clothing and soft hands, but not her presence at his brother's grave. "And what brings a merchant's daughter from Stavanger to weep at the grave of Einar Magnusson?" Halvard asked, his tone still sharp with suspicion. "Did you know my brother? Were you some friend of his that his family was never told about?" Alfred's face crumpled at the question, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She looked down at the wooden wolf in her hands, turning it over and over, as if seeking strength from its familiar form. "He gave this to me," she whispered, "last summer, when he came to Stavanger with a trading party. He said it would remind me of him when he was gone." She raised her eyes to meet Halvard's, and in them he saw a depth of pain that matched his own. "He promised he would return when the season turned, that we would what?" Halvard's voice was gentler now, though still wary. Something in her manner spoke of truth, and he found his anger cooling into something more complicated. Alfrid took a shaking breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the carved wolf. "We were to be married when he returned from his voyage. He said his family would welcome me, that there was room in Jordvik for one more." The words hit Halvard like a physical blow. Einar, engaged? His brother had said nothing of marriage plans, had given no hint that his heart had been captured during that trading expedition to the southern settlements. Halvard thought back to the summer before, trying to remember if Einar had seemed different when he returned from the journey, but the memory was clouded by time and his own preoccupations. "My brother spoke no word of this to his family," Halvard said slowly. "If there was truth to your claim, why would he keep such a thing secret?" "Because he wanted to be certain of his own heart before he spoke," Alfrid replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "He said you were a serious man, one who did not approve of hasty decisions. He planned to tell you after the raid, when he returned with enough silver to properly ask for my father's blessing and yours." There was something in her words that rang true. The reference to his serious nature was exactly the sort of thing Einar might have said, and the plan to wait until after the raid did sound like his brother's way of handling delicate family matters. Still, Halvard found himself struggling to accept this revelation. "If this is true," he said carefully, "then why come here now? Why not send word to our family, ask for our acknowledgement of your loss?" Alfred's composure cracked again, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold back words that desperately wanted to escape. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the morning breeze. "Because I could not tell my father. Because when Einar's ship was lost, I was alone with a secret that would have destroyed my family's honor." She looked up at Halvard with eyes that held a terrible mixture of hope and despair. "Because I carry his child." The words struck Halvard with the force of a lightning bolt, rendering him speechless. He stared at the young woman before him, this stranger who claimed to carry his brother's blood, and felt the world shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his brother's final months, about the plans and dreams that had died with him, suddenly took on new meaning. "You carry," he began, then stopped, unable to complete the thought. "I am 3 months along," Alfrid said, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat belly. "The child will come with the spring, when the snows melt and the fjords run free again." Halvard sank down onto one of the nearby burial stones, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. A child. Einar's child. His brother, who would never see another sunrise, would live on in this young woman's womb, in the air she carried. The magnitude of it was overwhelming, like trying to hold the ocean in his cupped hands. "Why have you come to me?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What do you expect from Einar's family?" Alfrid knelt again beside the grave, placing the wooden wolf gently among the other offerings. "I expect nothing," she said quietly. "But I had to tell him, had to let him know that he would not be forgotten completely. When my father discovers my condition, I will be cast out. I have enough silver hidden away to reach my aunt in the Shetland Islands, where I can disappear and raise the child away from questions and shame." "Cast out?" The words sparked something fierce in Halvard's chest, a protective instinct that he had not felt since Einar's death. What manner of father would abandon his own daughter? "The kind who values his reputation above his blood," Alfrid replied with bitter honesty. "I am his only child, meant to marry well and strengthen his trading alliances. A bastard grandchild would ruin everything he has worked to build." Halvard found himself studying her face, looking for some trace of his brother in her features, some sign that would confirm or deny her incredible claim. She was beautiful, certainly, with the kind of delicate features that would have appealed to Einar's romantic nature. And there was something in her manner, a blend of courage and vulnerability, that his brother would have found irresistible. "You risk much by coming here," he said finally. "If your father discovers where you have gone." "He believes I am visiting the shrine of St. Olaf in Trondheim," Alfrid interrupted. "The journey gave me the excuse I needed to travel north without suspicion. But I must return soon, before my absence is noted." The practical concerns were beginning to penetrate the shock of her revelation. If Alfrid was telling the truth, and something deep in his gut told him she was, then she carried not just Einar's child, but the future of their bloodline. In a culture that prized family and inheritance above almost everything else, the child in her womb represented a sacred trust. "The babe," Halvard said slowly, "when it is born, will it carry the marks of our blood?" Alfrid smiled for the first time since he had found her there, an expression that transformed her tear-streaked face and showed him a glimpse of what his brother must have seen in her. Your brother had unusual eyes, she said softly. Green as sea glass, flecked with gold like captured sunlight. He said they ran in your family line, a gift from some ancient ancestor who had trafficked with the sea gods themselves. The description was perfect, down to details that only someone intimate with Einar could have known. Those distinctive eyes had marked their bloodline for generations, appearing randomly in children who might otherwise bear no resemblance to their forebears. If this child inherited them, it would be proof beyond question of its parentage. Standing there in the burial field, with the morning mist beginning to burn away under the strengthening sun, Halvard felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. This young woman, this stranger who claimed to carry his brother's legacy, would need protection in the difficult months ahead. The question was whether he could provide it, and what the cost might be to his family and his position in the village. The choice, he realized, would define not just his own future, but the future of his brother's bloodline. And time, as always in such matters, was running short. The silence stretched between them like a frozen river, fraught with currents that could either support or destroy. Halvard studied Alfrid's face, searching for any sign of deception, but found only the raw honesty of someone who had nothing left to lose. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the burial field around them. Generations of his ancestors, watching this momentous decision from their stone-marked graves. You cannot return to your father, Halvard said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Not if what you say is true about his nature. Alfred's eyes widened with something that might have been hope, though she clearly dared not voice it. I have told you, I do not expect. What you expect and what honor demands are different things, Halvard interrupted, rising from the burial stone where he had been sitting. If you carry my brother's child, then you carry the blood of Magnus Ironside, of Thorvald the Deep-Minded, of warriors whose names are carved in the memory of these stones. That child is not some shameful secret to be hidden away in distant islands. The conviction in his own words surprised him. Minutes ago, he had been a man wrapped in the familiar routines of grief, visiting his brother's grave as he had done every morning for a year. Now he stood at the threshold of a decision that would reshape everything. His duties, his future, perhaps even his understanding of who Einar had truly been. But your family, Alfrid said hesitantly. They do not know me. They have no reason to accept the word of a stranger, especially one who comes with such a claim. Halvard considered this. She was right, of course. Astrid would be suspicious of any woman who appeared claiming connection to Einar, and his parents would need time to accept such a fundamental change in their understanding of their lost son. The village itself would buzz with speculation and gossip, some supportive, others inevitably cruel. My sister will question you closely, he warned. She has the sight, or claims to, and can read the truth in people's faces better than most. If you are lying to me, she will know it. I welcome her questions, Alfrid replied with quiet dignity. I have lived with this secret for months, and the burden of it has nearly crushed me. To finally speak the truth, even if it brings judgment, feels like drawing breath after drowning. There was something in her manner that reminded him powerfully of Einar, not in looks, for she was fair where his brother had been dark, delicate where Einar had been robust, but in the core of integrity that seemed to shine through her words. His brother had possessed that same quality of essential honesty, an inability to sustain deception even when it might have served him well. There is a ritual, Halvard said slowly, thinking through the implications as he spoke. an ancient way of testing such claims. Elder Bjorn would know the proper forms. Alfrid nodded, though he could see the fear flickering behind her composed facade. I am willing to submit to whatever tests your people require. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Astrid was walking through the burial field towards them, her auburn hair bright in the morning sun, her expression curious but guarded. She moved with the confident grace of a woman accustomed to managing complex household affairs, her keen eyes already taking in the scene before her brother deep in conversation with a young woman she had never seen before. "Brother," Astrid called out when she was still several paces away, "you have been gone longer than usual." I grew concerned. Halvard felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Once he spoke, there would be no taking back the words, no returning to the simpler grief that had defined his life for the past year. "Astrid," he said carefully, "I would have you meet Alfrid Gunnsdotter of Stavanger. She has come with news of our brother." His sister's steps slowed, her expression sharpening with sudden intensity. Astrid had always been protective of Einar's memory, quick to defend him from any slight or criticism. The idea that a stranger might have information about their lost brother would naturally put her on guard. "What manner of news?" Astrid asked, coming to a stop just outside the circle of burial stones. Her posture was alert, but not hostile, the stance of someone prepared for either welcome or unwelcome revelations. "Perhaps it would be better if we spoke in the hall," Halvard suggested, suddenly aware of how exposed they were here among the graves. "This is not a conversation for open ground." But Alfrid stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet courage. "Lady Astrid," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Halvard could detect beneath the surface. "I knew your brother. He gave me this." She held up the carved wolf. "And he gave me something else as well. I carry his child." The words hung in the morning air like the call of a hunting horn, clear and unmistakable. Astrid's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, suspicion, calculation, before settling into the kind of controlled blankness that Halvard recognized as his sister's way of masking intense emotion. "You carry Einar's child," Astrid repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of the words. "And you come to us now, a year after his death, to make this claim." "I come because I had nowhere else to turn," Alfrid replied with simple honesty. "My father would cast me out if he knew, and I wanted the child to know something of its father's people before... Before what?" Astrid's voice had taken on the sharp edge that Halvard knew meant she was deeply unsettled. "Before I disappear into exile where such questions cannot follow," Alfrid finished quietly. Astrid moved closer, circling Alfrid with the predatory grace of a she-wolf evaluating potential prey. Her eyes missed nothing, the quality of Alfred's clothing, the way she held herself, the wooden carving she clutched like a talisman. "Show me your hands," Astrid commanded suddenly. Alfrid extended her hands without hesitation, palms up. Astrid examined them closely, noting their softness, the absence of the calluses and scars that marked women who worked with their hands. "A merchant's daughter indeed," Astrid murmured. "Soft hands, fine clothes, silver at her belt. But that proves nothing about her connection to our brother." "The wolf proves something," Halvard interjected. "I remember Einar carving it during the winter before his last voyage. He was particular about its details, spent hours getting the proportions just right." Astrid took the wooden figure from Alfred's hands, examining it in the growing light. Halvard watched his sister's face as she traced the familiar workmanship with her fingers, recognizing their brother's distinctive style in every cut and curve. "This is Einar's work," she admitted reluctantly. "But how it came to be in your possession, that requires more explanation than you have given." "Then ask what you will," Alfrid said, meeting Astrid's challenging gaze with steady resolve. "I have nothing to hide, and no wish to deceive you. Your brother was a good man, who deserved better than the fate that found him." The sincerity in her voice seemed to give Astrid pause. Halvard's sister had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to see through pretense and deception to the truth beneath. Now she stood silently, weighing what she had heard against what her instincts told her about this young woman's character. "If what you claim is true," Astrid said finally, "then you are family, and family does not disappear into exile while carrying the blood of our line." "But verification must come first," Halvard added, thinking of the complications that lay ahead. "Elder Bjorn will know the proper forms, the tests that can confirm or deny such claims." Alfrid nodded, though Halvard could see the apprehension in her eyes. Whatever these tests might involve, they represented her only chance of finding acceptance among her brother's people. The alternative, exile and shame, held nothing but hardship and isolation. "Come then," Astrid said, her decision apparently made. "Let us return to the hall and speak of this properly. If you are to be tested, it should be done with all the formality such a momentous claim deserves." The great hall of Magnus Ironside stood like a sleeping giant at the heart of Jordvik, its massive timber beams darkened by decades of hearth smoke and winter storms. As they approached the imposing structure, Halvard felt the familiar weight of ancestral presence that always accompanied him when crossing the threshold of his family's home. The carved dragon heads that adorned the roofline seemed to watch their approach with ancient eyes, guardians of secrets and keepers of bloodline honor. Inside, the hall was dim and cool, lit only by the scattered light that filtered through the high windows and the glowing embers of the central hearth. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting scenes of legendary battles and mythic beasts, their colors muted by age, but still magnificent in their craftsmanship. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the lingering sense of the morning meal, fresh bread, roasted meat, and the bitter herbs that Astrid favored for her healing work. Magnus sat in his high seat at the far end of the hall, his once powerful frame diminished by grief, but still commanding respect. At 62 winters, he remained an imposing figure, his grey beard braided with silver rings that caught the firelight when he moved. His eyes, the same sea-green as Einar's had been, fixed on their small party with sharp attention. "Father," Halvard called out as they approached, "we have a visitor who brings news of Einar." Magnus straightened in his chair, sudden alertness replacing the distant melancholy that had characterized him since his younger son's death. "What manner of news?" His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command, though Halvard could hear the underlying tremor that spoke of barely controlled emotion. "Perhaps we should speak privately first," Astrid suggested, glancing meaningfully at the handful of servants who were going about their morning tasks in the hall. "This matter requires discretion." Magnus studied Alfrid with increasing interest, taking in her obvious quality and the nervous way she clutched the wooden wolf against her chest. "Servants," he commanded, "leave us. Return when the sun reaches its zenith." The hall emptied quickly, leaving only the family and their unexpected guest. Magnus gestured for them to approach his high seat, his eyes never leaving Alfred's face. "Speak then," he said simply. "Tell me what you know of my son." Alfrid took a steadying breath before stepping forward. "My lord, I am Alfrid Gunnsdottir of Stavanger. I knew your son Einar, and I carry his child." The words fell into the hall like stones into a deep, Well? Magnus sat utterly still for a long moment, his weathered hands gripping the carved arms of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. You claim to carry the blood of my blood. I do, my lord. The child will come with the spring. Magnus rose slowly from his seat, moving with the deliberate grace of a man who had learned to mask pain behind dignity. He descended the 3 steps that elevated his chair above the main floor, approaching Alfrid with measured steps. "Give me your hand," he commanded. Alfrid extended her right hand without hesitation. Magnus took it in both of his, studying her palm and fingers with the same intensity that Astrid had shown earlier. His examination was more thorough, however, noting not just the softness of her skin, but the length of her fingers, the shape of her nails, the way she held herself under scrutiny. "Merchant's daughter," he murmured, echoing his daughter's earlier assessment. "Well-bred, well-fed, accustomed to comfort." He looked up into her eyes. "But courage, too. It takes no small bravery to come among strangers with such a claim." "My lord!" "Call me Magnus," he interrupted gently. "If you speak truth, then ceremony has no place between us." He released her hand and stepped back, studying her face with the penetrating gaze that had made him respected as both warrior and leader. "Tell me of my son. What manner of man did you find him to be?" Relief flickered across Alfred's features at the gentler tone. "He was kind," she said simply. "Kinder than I expected a Viking warrior to be. He came to my father's trading house with a party of your men, seeking amber and seal oil for the winter stores. Most of the warriors were rough in their manner, interested only in commerce and quick departure." "But not Einar," Magnus prompted. "No, my lord. Magnus. He noticed that I was reading when he entered the shop, and he asked about the manuscript. It was a collection of Saxon poems, translated into our tongue. He was amazed that a woman could read, and even more amazed that I could read both languages." Halvard felt a familiar pang at this detail. Einar had always been fascinated by learning, by stories and songs from distant lands. Their father had ensured both sons could read, but Einar had pursued it with genuine pleasure, while Halvard had seen it merely as another useful skill. "He asked if I would read to him," Alfrid continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to the memory. "So I did, there in the shop while his companions conducted their business. The poem was about a warrior who returned from battle to find his hall empty, his people scattered, his glory turned to ash. Einar wept when I finished reading." Magnus nodded slowly. He always felt things deeply, that boy. Too deeply, perhaps. He said the poem reminded him of the temporary nature of all earthly things, how even the mightiest halls would someday stand empty. But then he smiled and said that made each moment of joy more precious, not less. "Those are his words," Astrid said quietly. "I have heard him speak just so." Alfrid turned to include Halvard's sister in her narrative. He asked if he might visit again before his party departed. I said yes, though I knew my father would disapprove. For 3 days, he came to the shop each evening. We would walk along the harbour while he told me stories of your village, of his family, of the adventures he had seen. "And you fell in love," Magnus stated rather than asked. Colour rose in Alfred's cheeks, but she met his eyes steadily. "Yes, as did he, or so he claimed." "Einar was not one for false claims in matters of the heart," Halvard said, remembering his brother's earnest nature. "If he spoke of love, he meant it." On the last night, before his party was to leave, he asked if I would wait for him. He said he would return after one more voyage, with enough silver to approach my father properly and ask for my hand. Alfred's voice caught slightly. He gave me the wooden wolf as a token, something to remember him by during the long months apart. Magnus nodded thoughtfully. And when did you last bleed? The directness of the question would have scandalized more conventional company, but in matters of lineage and inheritance, such concerns took precedence over delicate sensibilities. Alfrid answered without flinching. Not since the harvest month. The babe quickened just days ago. Show me, Astrid commanded, her healer's instincts taking over. Alfrid hesitated only briefly before loosening her belt and allowing her dress to fall more naturally around her form. The gentle curve of early pregnancy was barely visible, but it was there, unmistakable to eyes trained to recognize such signs. 3 months, perhaps a little more, Astrid confirmed. The timing matches her story. Magnus resumed his seat, settling back into the carved chair that had been his for more than 20 years. His expression was thoughtful, weighing not just Alfred's words, but all the subtle indicators that might confirm or deny her claim. If this is truth, he said finally, then you are welcome in this hall, and the child you carry is heir to more than just our bloodline. My lord? Alfred's confusion was evident. Einar was the younger son, but he was also unmarried and without acknowledged heirs. His portion of our holdings would normally have passed to Halvard upon my death. Magnus's sea-green eyes fixed on his older son. But a legitimate child, even born after the father's death, has claim to that inheritance. The implications of this statement settled over them like a physical weight. Halvard had always assumed that he would inherit the entirety of his family's holdings, that the responsibility for maintaining the family's position would rest solely on his shoulders. The possibility of sharing that burden with a nephew or niece was both welcome and complicated. Father, Halvard said carefully, we should summon Elder Bjorn before making such pronouncements. There are proper forms for establishing legitimacy. Indeed there are, Magnus agreed, and they will be followed to the letter. But first, let us hear the rest of this young woman's tale. Elder Bjorn arrived at the hall just as the sun reached its highest point, his ancient frame supported by a walking staff carved from ash wood and adorned with runic symbols that predated the coming of the White Christ to their lands. His blind eyes, clouded with age but still sharp in their own way, seemed to peer directly into the souls of those around him as he made his way slowly across the hall's timber floor. Magnus, the old man called out in his voice like grinding stone. I hear whispers on the wind of momentous claims and ancient blood. Shall we speak of such things in the proper manner? Indeed we shall, old friend, Magnus replied, rising from his high seat to greet the village elder with the respect due to one who had counseled 3 generations of leaders. Come, sit beside the fire and hear what this young woman has to say. Bjorn settled himself carefully onto the carved bench that had been placed near the central hearth, his gnarled hands folding over the head of his staff. Though his eyes could no longer see the physical world, Halvard had often observed that the old man seemed to perceive truths that escaped those with clear vision. Bring her forward, then, Bjorn commanded. Let these old hands feel the measure of her, as they once felt the measure of young Einar before his final voyage. Alfrid approached the elder with visible nervousness, her steps careful on the uneven floor. When she stood before him, Bjorn gestured for her to kneel, which she did without hesitation. Your hands, child, the elder said gently, his tone much softer than the commanding voice he used for formal pronouncements. As Bjorn's weathered fingers traced the lines of Alfred's palms, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. He examined not just her hands, but her wrists, feeling for the pulse that spoke of her current condition, the subtle signs that a practiced healer could read like runes carved in stone. "You carry life," he stated with certainty. "New life that quickens with each passing day. But more than this." His fingers moved to her face, tracing her features with the delicate touch of one who had learned to see through his hands. "There is truth in your bearing, honesty in the way you hold yourself before judgment. Yet truth and proof are not always the same thing." "Elder," Alfrid said quietly, "I submit myself to whatever tests you deem necessary. I have no wish to deceive anyone about matters so sacred." Bjorn nodded approvingly. "Wisdom in one so young. Very well then. Let us speak of the testing that our ancestors decreed for such situations." He turned his blind gaze toward Magnus. "The ritual of blood witness. Do you recall the forms?" "I remember the stories," Magnus replied carefully. "But it has been many years since such a ritual was needed in Jordvik." "Then I shall instruct you all," Bjorn said, his voice taking on the ceremonial cadence he used for the recounting of sacred traditions. "When a woman claims to carry the child of a dead warrior, and that claim affects matters of inheritance and bloodline, there are 3 tests that must be fulfilled." Halvard found himself leaning forward, fascinated despite his anxiety. He had heard references to such rituals in the old songs, but had never expected to witness one. "The first test is the test of knowledge," Bjorn continued. "The claimant must demonstrate intimate understanding of the dead man's nature. Not just public knowledge that any stranger might learn, but private details that only a lover would know." Astrid stirred on her bench. "I would conduct such a test," she said firmly. "I knew my brother's heart better than anyone." "The second test is the test of objects," Bjorn went on. "Sacred items that belonged to the deceased must recognize the truth of the claim. If the child she carries truly shares the father's blood, these objects will bear witness." "And the third test?" Magnus asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "The test of birth," Bjorn concluded solemnly. "When the child is born, it must bear the physical marks of the bloodline it claims to inherit. In your family's case, that would be the distinctive eyes that have marked your line for 7 generations." The weight of these requirements settled over the assembly like a heavy cloak. Halvard could see the determination in Alfrid's face, warring with natural apprehension. She was committing herself to months of scrutiny and testing, with no guarantee that the outcome would be favorable. "I accept these tests," Alfrid said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was undertaking. "When would you have them begin?" "The first test can begin immediately," Astrid said, rising from her seat with the purposeful energy that marked her when she had made a decision. "If you truly knew my brother as you claim, then you will be able to answer questions that no stranger could. And the second test requires preparation," Bjorn added. "Certain items must be gathered, rituals observed. Perhaps tomorrow, when the moon is dark and the ancient powers listen more closely to mortal concerns." "What manner of items?" Halvard asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Things that bore his touch in life, that knew the warmth of his hands and the beating of his heart," Bjorn explained. "His favorite weapon, a piece of clothing worn close to the skin, something he crafted with his own hands." Halvard thought immediately of Einar's seax, the long knife that had been his constant companion since their father had given it to him upon reaching manhood. The blade had been forged by their grandfather and carried a power that went beyond mere craftsmanship. If any object could serve as a witness to bloodline truth, it would be that ancient weapon. "I will gather what is needed," he promised. "Then let us begin with what can be tested now," Astrid said, moving to stand directly in front of Alfrid. Tell me, if you knew my brother as intimately as you claim, what frightened him most in all the world?" The question was unexpected and deeply personal. Halvard found himself genuinely curious about how Alfrid would respond. He thought he knew Einar's deepest fears, but his brother might have revealed different vulnerabilities to a lover than to family. "Being forgotten," Alfrid answered without hesitation. "Not dying in battle, not pain or suffering, but the idea that he might pass from this world without leaving any mark upon it, that future generations would not even remember his name." The accuracy of this answer struck Halvard like a physical blow. It was precisely what Einar had confided to him during one of their late-night conversations by the fire, a fear that seemed almost contradictory in someone so full of life and ambition. "His greatest joy?" Astrid pressed, her healer's instincts probing for any sign of deception. "Children," Alfrid replied immediately. "Watching them learn and grow, seeing the world fresh through their eyes. He said that children were proof that the future held infinite possibility." Again, the answer rang true. Einar had always been beloved by the village children, spending hours teaching them to whittle and telling them stories of distant lands. It was knowledge that a careful observer might have gained, but combined with the previous answer, it suggested genuine intimacy. "One more question," Astrid said, her voice softer now. "What did he say was his greatest regret?" This time Alfrid hesitated, tears gathering in her eyes. That he had waited so long to find love, and that when he finally did, duty called him away before he could properly claim it. The silence that followed this answer was profound. Even Bjorn nodded slowly, recognizing the ring of truth in words that no stranger could have invented. The moon hung dark in the star-scattered sky as the second night of testing arrived. Halvard stood in the central courtyard of the family compound, surrounded by the items he had carefully gathered according to Elder Bjorn's precise instructions. Einar's seax lay on a cloth of undyed wool, its blade catching what little starlight penetrated the darkness. Beside it rested his brother's favorite tunic, the one he had worn during feast days and celebrations, still bearing the faint scent of the pine oil he had favored for his beard. The third item was perhaps the most significant, a silver arm ring that had been their grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of warriors, and worn by Einar on all formal occasions. The metal was old and precious, inscribed with runes that spoke of protection and strength, and it had never left their family's possession since the day their ancestor had taken it from a Saxon king in battle. Astrid moved quietly around the circle they had marked in the courtyard, sprinkling salt and ash in the ancient patterns that Elder Bjorn had taught her. Magnus stood at the eastern point of the circle, holding a torch that cast dancing shadows across the assembled objects. The ritual itself was older than the village, older than memory, reaching back to the time when the gods walked among men and the barriers between worlds were thin as morning mist. "It is ready," Astrid announced, her voice carrying the formal cadence that sacred moments demanded. Elder Bjorn entered the circle with slow, reverent steps, his staff tapping against the packed earth as he approached the arranged items. Behind him came Alfrid, her face pale but determined in the flickering torchlight. She had fasted since dawn as the ritual required, taking only water blessed by the old gods and the sacred springs that fed the village wells. "Kneel, child," Bjorn commanded gently, "and place your hands upon each object in turn. If the blood you carry recognizes its own, these sacred things will bear witness." Halvard watched with tense anticipation as Alfrid knelt beside the cloth. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Einar's seax, but her touch was firm and reverent when her fingers closed around the ancient weapon's grip. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just a young woman, kneeling in darkness, holding a dead man's knife. Then the blade began to warm. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but the warmth spread from the metal into Alfrid's hands and up her arms like the gentle heat of a banked fire, coming back to life. Magnus stepped closer with his torch, and in its light they could all see the soft silver glow that had begun to emanate from the Seax's blade. "The weapon knows," Bjorn said with quiet satisfaction. "It remembers the blood that once wielded it, and recognizes that blood in what you carry." Alfred's eyes were wide with wonder, but she moved obediently to the next item. When her hands touched Einar's tunic, the worn wool seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone, and for just a moment, the scent of pine oil grew strong enough for all of them to smell. The arm ring was the final test. As Alfred's fingers traced the ancient runes carved into its surface, the silver began to sing, a high, pure note that seemed to come from the metal itself, so faint it was almost below the threshold of hearing, but unmistakably present. "3 witnesses," Bjorn declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "The blood is true. The claim is valid. What she carries is indeed the seed of Einar Magnusson." The relief that washed over Alfred's face was visible even in the torchlight. She had endured 2 days of testing and scrutiny, answering countless questions about her relationship with Einar, submitting to examinations both gentle and invasive, all while knowing that failure would mean exile and shame. Now, with the ancient ritual complete, she had earned something precious beyond measure, acceptance into a family that valued honor above gold and bloodline above convenience. Magnus stepped forward and helped her to her feet, his weathered hands steady and sure. "Rise, daughter of our house," he said formally. "You have proven your claim beyond question, and the child you carry will be welcomed as our own blood." But even as the words of acceptance were spoken, Halvard found himself wrestling with new concerns that the ritual's success had brought into sharp focus. Alfrid might have proven her connection to Einar, but she was still a stranger to their ways, a merchant's daughter raised in comfort who knew nothing of the harsh realities of Viking life. How would she adapt to their customs? How would the village accept her? And most immediately pressing, what would happen when her father discovered her absence? "We must send word to Stavanger," Halvard said, as they gathered the ritual items. "Alfred's father will expect her return soon, and when she fails to appear, he will come looking for her," Alfrid finished, her newfound relief clouded by anxiety. "My father is not a man to accept mysteries or unexplained absences. When he discovers where I have gone and why, then we must be prepared to receive him with honor," Magnus declared. "You are under our protection now, and no father, no matter how angry, will be permitted to harm you or the child you carry." This declaration, while noble in intent, carried complications that Halvard could already foresee. Gunnar of Stavanger was reportedly a wealthy and influential merchant, with connections throughout the trading networks that linked the Norse settlements. An open confrontation with such a man could have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate family. "Perhaps there is a middle path," Astrid suggested thoughtfully. "If we approach Gunnar with respect, explain the circumstances properly, offer appropriate compensation for his daughter's bride price." "You think too kindly of his nature," Alfrid interrupted sadly. "My father cares more for his reputation than for my well-being. The knowledge that I carry a bastard child, even one acknowledged by the father's family, will be seen as a stain on his honor that no amount of silver can wash clean." The complexity of the situation was becoming increasingly apparent. They had solved the immediate question of Alfred's legitimacy, but in doing so, they had committed themselves to a course of action that would inevitably draw them into conflict with powerful forces beyond their village borders. "There is another consideration," Elder Bjorn said quietly, his blind eyes seeming to peer into futures yet unformed. "The child this woman carries will need protection, not just from immediate threats, but from those who might see opportunity in exploiting a young heir with a vulnerable mother." Halvard felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like chain mail. As the child's uncle and closest male relative, he would be expected to serve as guardian and protector until the heir came of age. It was a role that would define the next 15 years of his life, shaping every decision and coloring every relationship he might form. "The spring birthing will bring its own challenges," Astrid added, her healer's knowledge informing her concerns. "Alfrid will need proper care, experienced women to attend the birth, protective rituals to ensure safe delivery. And if the child bears the family eyes, word will spread quickly throughout the region." The distinctive sea-green eyes that marked their bloodline were not just a matter of family pride. They were a visible sign of legitimacy that would be recognized by allies and enemies alike. A child bearing those eyes would be acknowledged as a true heir by any who saw them, but that same recognition could make both mother and child targets for those who preferred the bloodline to end with Einar's death. As they walked back toward the hall, the ritual items carefully gathered and the sacred circle properly closed, Halvard found himself thinking of the quiet life he had built around his grief and duty. That life was ending, replaced by something far more complex and demanding. The choice he had made by the burial stones 3 days ago was revealing its full implications, and there was no path back to the simpler existence he had known. But looking at Alfrid, seeing the hope in her eyes, and the unconscious protective gesture as her hand moved to cover her still flat belly, Halvard knew he had chosen correctly. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the child she carried was Einar's legacy, and that legacy deserved every protection their family could provide. The messenger arrived at dawn on the 5th day, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the urgency of his news. Halvard was already awake, tending to the morning chores that had become his routine when the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the courtyard. The rider bore the colors of Stavanger, and his arrival could mean only one thing. Gunnar the merchant had discovered his daughter's absence and her destination. But when the messenger dismounted and approached the hall, his first words shattered every assumption Halvard had made about the situation. "I seek Alfrid Gunnsdotter," the man called out, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "I bring word from her father and from King Harald himself. The message is urgent and concerns matters of life and death." King Harald. The name struck like a thunderbolt, transforming what had seemed like a family matter into something with implications that reached to the very heart of the kingdom. Halvard felt his mouth go dry as he considered what possible connection there could be between their small village drama and the attention of the most powerful man in Norway. Magnus emerged from the hall, still fastening his belt, his expression alert and wary. "I am Magnus Ironside, lord of this hall. Speak your message, and speak it plainly." The messenger reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a scroll sealed with wax that bore the distinctive mark of royal authority. "My lords," he said formally, 3 days ago, King Harald received disturbing intelligence from his spies in the Danish court. There is a plot against his rule, one that involves the elimination of certain bloodlines that the conspirators view as threats to their plans. Halvard exchanged glances with his father, both men recognizing the deadly seriousness of such an accusation. Plots against the king were not uncommon, But royal spies rarely concerned themselves with the affairs of minor noble families unless those affairs held greater significance than appeared on the surface. "What has this to do with the daughter of a Stavanger merchant?" Magnus asked carefully. "Because Gunnar of Stavanger is not merely a merchant," the messenger replied, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. "He is one of King Harald's most trusted agents, a man who has spent 20 years building a network of contacts throughout the trading routes that stretch from Iceland to Constantinople. And his daughter is not just any merchant's daughter. She is the key to intelligence that could save or damn the kingdom." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Alfrid, whom they had welcomed as a pregnant young woman seeking protection, was the daughter of a royal spy. Her presence in their hall suddenly took on implications that reached far beyond family honor and bloodline legitimacy. "Where is she?" the messenger demanded urgently. "I must speak with her immediately." "She is within," Magnus replied. "But explain yourself more fully before I wake a woman who has endured much strain in recent days." The messenger looked around nervously, as if expecting enemies to emerge from the morning shadows. "Gunnar discovered that his activities were known to the Danish conspirators. They have been watching his family, planning to use his daughter as leverage against him. When he learned that she had disappeared from Stavanger, he feared the worst, that she had already been taken." "But she came here of her own will," Halvard protested, his mind struggling to process this new information. "She came to tell us about Einar's child." "Einar?" The messenger's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Einar Magnusson, who died in the Orkney raid, the man who saved Thorkel the Red from drowning. You knew my brother. I knew of him. Thorkel the Red serves King Harald directly now, and he has spoken often of the warrior who died, saving his life." The messenger's expression grew even more grave. "This changes everything. If Alfrid is here because she carries Einar's child, then the implications are even more serious than we feared." "Explain," Magnus commanded, his patience wearing thin with the cryptic pronouncements. "Thorkel the Red was not just any warrior on that raid," the messenger continued. "He was carrying secret messages to the king's allies in the Orkney Islands, negotiations that could determine the balance of power in the northern seas. When the ships were wrecked, those messages were lost, and Thorkel has spent the past year trying to reconstruct the intelligence they contained." Halvard felt pieces of a vast puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "You think Einar knew something about these messages?" "We think Einar might have saved more than just Thorkel's life. If he recovered any of the lost documents, if he shared any of their contents with someone he trusted, like the woman he planned to marry," Magnus finished grimly. The messenger nodded. "Gunnar believes that his daughter might possess information that could expose or protect the king's northern alliances. If the Danish conspirators discover her location and capture her, they will torture her for whatever she knows," Halvard said, the full horror of the situation finally becoming clear. At that moment, Alfrid appeared in the doorway of the hall, drawn by the sound of urgent voices. She moved carefully, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her expression curious but wary as she took in the scene before her. "Alfrid," the messenger said with obvious relief, "thank the gods you are safe. Your father has been frantic with worry since you disappeared from Stavanger." "Olaf?" Alfrid recognized the messenger with surprise. "What are you doing here? And why do you speak of my father's worry when he thinks I am on pilgrimage to Trondheim?" "Because your pilgrimage story fooled no one who matters," Olaf replied grimly. "The same Danish agents who have been watching your family tracked your movements north. They know you came to Jordvik, and they are perhaps only hours behind me." The colour drained from Alfred's face as the implications sank in. But I told no one of my true destination. How could they possibly? Because they have been watching you for weeks, waiting for you to lead them to something they could use against your father. Your sudden departure from Stavanger was exactly the opportunity they needed. Halvard felt the familiar weight of Sorrow-biter at his side and found himself calculating distances, defensive positions, the number of warriors he could summon to the hall's protection. Whatever was coming, they would face it, as his ancestors had faced threats to their home and hearth. "How many?" Magnus asked, his mind moving along similar tactical lines. "At least 20, possibly more. Professional warriors, well armed and mounted. They will not come seeking negotiation or compromise." "Then we must be ready to give them the welcome they deserve," Halvard said, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon's grip. But Alfrid stepped forward, her face set with sudden determination. "No," she said firmly. "If they want me, then running will only delay the inevitable. But I will not see good people die for my sake." "You think to surrender yourself to these Danish dogs?" Magnus's voice carried outrage at the suggestion. "I think to end this before it begins," Alfrid replied. "But first, I must tell you something that Einar shared with me. Something I have kept secret until now, because I didn't understand its importance." The courtyard fell silent, except for the morning wind stirring through the roof thatch. Whatever secret Alfrid had been carrying, it was clearly connected to the deadly forces now converging on their village. "Einar did save something from the wreck," she continued, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Not just Thorkel's life, but a waterproof message case that had been strapped to his body. The night before Einar died, he gave it to me, made me promise to keep it safe until someone came who could prove they served King Harald." She reached inside her dress and withdrew a small cylindrical case made of carved walrus ivory, its surface inscribed with runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The case was clearly ancient, probably crafted by master artisans in service to royalty. "This is what they truly seek," Alfrid said, holding the case out toward the messenger. "Not me, not my father's network, but the intelligence that Einar died protecting." Olaf's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the precious artifact. "The king's northern negotiations," he breathed. "The alliance treaties that were thought lost forever. Now you understand why they have pursued you so relentlessly," Magnus said to Alfrid, "and why the stakes of protecting you have just become higher than we ever imagined." The war horn sounded across Jordvik like the cry of an angry giant, its deep note echoing off the surrounding peaks and rolling down the fjord to warn every soul within, hearing that danger approached. Halvard stood atop the watchtower that guarded the village's northern approach, his sea-green eyes scanning the forest line, where movement flickered between the dark pines like shadows given life. 23 riders, he called down to Magnus, who was organizing the village's defenders in the courtyard below. "Armed and moving in formation. These are no common raiders." The message case that Alfrid had carried for nearly a year now rested in the village's most sacred place, buried beneath the altar stone of the small temple where their ancestors had worshipped the old gods for countless generations. Elder Bjorn had performed the hiding ritual himself, calling upon Odin, the Far-Seer, and Frigg the Protector, to shield the precious artifact from enemy eyes. But hiding the case would mean nothing if its guardians were dead or captured. The Danish agents had come too far and risked too much to be turned away by empty hands and false denials. They would tear the village apart, stone by stone if necessary, to find what they sought. "The women and children," Halvard called to his sister. "Safe in the root cellars beneath the hall," Astrid replied, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped them all. Alfrid argued against hiding, but I convinced her that her first duty is to the child she carries. Halvard nodded, relieved that at least one element of the coming conflict was secured. Alfred's safety had become paramount, not just because of her connection to Einar, but because of the intelligence she might still possess. The message case she had revealed was likely only part of whatever secrets had died with his brother on that distant shore. Magnus emerged from the armory, carrying the mail shirt that had belonged to his grandfather. The iron rings clinked softly as he moved, the sound both comforting and ominous in the morning air. At 62 winters, he was past the age when most men continued to swing a sword in battle, but the fire in his eyes spoke of a warrior's spirit that age had not quenched. "How many men can we muster?" Halvard asked as he descended from the watchtower. 14 proven fighters, plus perhaps 6 more who can hold a spear if pressed," Magnus replied grimly. "Not enough to meet their charge in open battle, but sufficient for a defense if we choose our ground wisely." The odds were sobering, but not impossible. Viking tactics favored defensive fighting when facing superior numbers, using terrain and fortifications to negate the advantage of mounted warriors. The hall itself was built like a fortress, its thick walls and narrow windows designed to withstand siege, and the village's layout provided multiple fallback positions if the first line of defense failed. "They will likely offer terms first," Elder Bjorn observed, emerging from the temple where he had completed the concealment ritual. "Danish nobles prefer to take what they want through intimidation rather than costly battle, especially when dealing with King Harald's subjects." "And what manner of terms might they offer?" Magnus asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Surrender the woman and whatever she carries, in exchange for the village being spared destruction," Bjorn replied. "They will promise safe passage for all others, swear oaths of non-interference, perhaps even offer silver as compensation for cooperation." Halvard spat into the dust at his feet. "Promises from Danish agents who serve enemies of our king. Their oaths are worth less than morning mist." "Nevertheless, we must hear them out," Magnus said, with the wisdom of a man who had survived by choosing his battles carefully. "If only to buy time for our preparations." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and soon the Danish force came into view around the bend in the forest track. They rode in perfect formation, their mail gleaming in the morning sun, their shields bearing the device of some minor Danish lord whose ambitions had aligned with the larger conspiracy against King Harald's rule. Their leader was a tall man with grey-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His horse was a magnificent stallion, bred for war, and his weapons were of the finest quality, a sword with silver fittings and a spear whose point caught the light like captured fire. This was no common mercenary, but a warrior of noble blood who had staked his reputation on the success of this mission. "Magnus Ironside," the Danish leader called out, as his force came to a halt just beyond effective arrow range. "I am Sven Haraldsson, son of Harald Bluetooth, and I come seeking justice for wrongs done to my people." The claim of royal parentage was almost certainly false. Harald Bluetooth's sons were well known throughout the northern kingdoms, and this man bore none of their distinctive features. But the invocation of royal blood served its purpose, lending weight to whatever demands would follow. "I know you for what you are," Magnus replied, his voice carrying across the open ground between them. "Speak your business and be done with it." "You harbor a woman who has stolen something precious from my lord's household," Sven continued, his words carefully chosen to establish a legal justification for his presence. "Return her and what she has taken, and no harm will come to your village or your people." "We harbour no thieves here," Magnus responded firmly. "All who shelter under our roof do so by right of guest friendship or family bond." Sven's smile was cold as winter ice. "Then perhaps you do not know the full truth of your guests. The woman Alfrid carries intelligence stolen from my lord's agents, information that could endanger innocent lives if misused. Surely a man of honor would not protect such treachery." The accusation was cleverly constructed, designed to sow doubt and provide moral justification for whatever violence might follow. But Halvard had learned enough about Alfred's true nature during the past days to recognize the falsehood underlying Sven's words. "The only treachery I see," Halvard called out, stepping forward to stand beside his father, "comes from Danish dogs who violate the borders of King Harald's realm without permission or proper authority." Sven's expression darkened at the insult, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword hilt. "You would do well to mind your tongue, Viking. My patience has limits, and my men are eager to test their steel against northern warriors." "Then let them test it," Magnus replied, his own hand settling on the pommel of his ancient sword. "But know that Vikings do not surrender their guests to foreign threats, whatever pretty words dress up the demand." The negotiation, such as it was, had reached its inevitable conclusion. Honor and pragmatism pulled in opposite directions, leaving no room for compromise. Sven would not leave empty-handed, and Magnus could not surrender Alfrid without violating everything his culture held sacred about the protection of guests and family. "So be it," Sven said finally, raising his spear in signal to his warriors. "When your hall burns and your men lie dead, remember that you chose this fate." As the Danish force began to spread out in preparation for assault, Halvard found himself thinking not of the battle to come, but of the child that Alfrid carried. That unborn heir represented more than just Einar's legacy now. It had become a symbol of resistance against foreign threats, a living reminder that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "Take your positions," Magnus commanded, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him respected as both warrior and leader. "Remember that we fight not just for our own lives, but for the honor of our bloodline and the safety of those who depend upon our strength." The village's defenders moved with practiced efficiency to their assigned places. Archers took position on the hall's roof and in the windows of the surrounding buildings. Spearmen formed a defensive line across the main approach, their shields overlapping in the ancient pattern that had served Viking warriors for generations. A small reserve force gathered near the hall's entrance, ready to respond to any breakthrough or unexpected threat. Halvard checked his equipment one final time. Sorrowbiter hung at his side, its familiar weight a comfort in the moments before battle. His shield was solid oak, reinforced with iron, painted with the wolf's head that served as his personal device. His mail shirt, inherited from his grandfather, bore the scars of previous conflicts, but remained sound and serviceable. "Brother," Astrid called softly as she approached with a small clay vessel in her hands. "Drink this before the fighting begins." The vessel contained a mixture of herbs and fermented honey, designed to sharpen the senses and dull the awareness of pain. It was an old warrior's preparation, used by their ancestors before great battles, when survival might depend on fighting through wounds that would normally disable a man. As Halvard drained the bitter mixture, he caught sight of Alfrid peering through one of the hall's small windows. Her face was pale with fear, but her eyes held the same determination he had seen when she first revealed her connection to Einar. Whatever happened in the next hour, she would face it with the courage that had brought her this far. The Danish warriors finished their preparations and began their advance, moving forward at a measured pace that spoke of professional discipline. These were not wild raiders seeking quick plunder, but trained soldiers executing a carefully planned operation. The coming battle would test not just individual courage, but the tactical skills that separated veteran warriors from mere fighters. "For Einar," Halvard whispered, drawing Sorrowbiter from its sheath. "For family. For honor." The time for words had ended. Now only steel would speak. The first arrow sang through the morning air like a deadly bird, its iron point seeking flesh with the hunger of a striking serpent. It struck the shield of young Thorvald, the smith's son, penetrating the oak planks, but stopping just short of the arm that bore it. The boy, barely 16 winters but already showing the promise of his father's strength, pulled the shaft free and cast it aside with grim determination. "Steady!" Magnus called to his men as more arrows began to fall among the defensive line. "Let them waste their shafts on wood and iron. Our time will come." The Danish advance had begun with a disciplined arrow storm, their mounted archers circling at the edge of effective range while their foot soldiers formed up for the main assault. It was textbook tactics, the kind of methodical approach that professional warriors use to minimize their own casualties while wearing down defenders' morale. But Vikings had been defending their homes against such tactics for generations, and the men of Jordvik knew their business. They kept their shields high and their formation tight, presenting no easy targets while conserving their own arrows for more decisive moments. Halvard crouched behind the low stone wall that protected the hall's courtyard, watching the enemy movements with the calculating eye of a veteran warrior. The Danes had split their force into 3 groups, mounted archers providing covering fire, dismounted infantry preparing for direct assault, and a small reserve that would likely attempt to find an alternate approach to the village's defenses. "Astrid," he called to his sister, who was tending to the archer positions on the hall's roof. "Watch the northern approaches. They will try to circle around while we are engaged to the front." His sister nodded and moved with swift efficiency to relay warning to the men positioned to guard against such flanking attempts. Her healer's knowledge of anatomy made her surprisingly effective at directing defensive fire, knowing exactly where arrows needed to strike to disable rather than merely wound attacking warriors. The Danish infantry began their advance in earnest, their shields locked together in the wedge formation that had served northern warriors since the days when Romans ruled the southern lands. Sven Haraldsson rode behind them, his spear raised high as he shouted encouragement to his men. "For the honor of Denmark," the Danish leader cried, "for silver and glory, let these Vikings learn the price of defying their betters." The Vikings answered with their own war cry, a sound like wolves howling in the deep forest, full of savage promise and ancestral fury. It was a sound their enemies had learned to fear from Iceland to Constantinople, the voice of men who would rather die standing than live kneeling. Magnus raised his ancient sword, its blade catching the morning light like captured lightning. "For Jordvik," he roared, "for our fathers and our sons, let them come and test our steel." The clash, when it came, was like thunder breaking over the mountainous peaks. Danish spears met Viking shields with the sound of hammer on anvil, and the air filled with the grunt of straining men and the ring of iron on iron. The defensive line held, but barely, Viking warriors giving ground step by grudging step under the pressure of superior numbers. Halvard found himself facing a Danish warrior whose scarred face spoke of many battles survived. The man's sword moved like quicksilver, testing Halvard's defenses with subtle feints and sudden attacks. But Sorrowbiter had tasted blood in conflicts across the northern seas, and its wielder had learned his craft in the hardest school of all, actual combat against men who meant to kill him. The Danish warrior's blade slid off Halvard's shield and left him momentarily overextended. Sorrowbiter struck like a serpent, its ancient edge finding the gap between helmet and mailcoif. The Dane dropped without a sound, his blood darkening the earth where he fell. "Behind you!" Thorvald's voice carried warning just in time for Halvard to spin and meet the charge of another attacker, this one wielding a war axe with the skill of a master. The impact of the blocked blow sent shockwaves up Halvard's arm, but his shield held and his counterattack opened the Dane's guard just enough for a killing thrust. Around him, the battle raged with the fury of a spring storm. Vikings and Danes traded lives with the grim efficiency of professional killers, each side knowing that victory would come only through the complete destruction of their enemies. No quarter would be asked or given in such a fight. Too much depended on the outcome for mercy to find any place on this blood-soaked ground. Magnus fought like a man half his age, his sword weaving patterns of death around his position as he anchored the center of the defensive line. His grandfather's mail shirt had turned aside 3 spear thrusts that should have ended his life, and his blade had already claimed 2 Danish lives in return for their presumption. But the pressure was beginning to tell. The Vikings were skilled and determined, but they were outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, and Danish reserves were beginning to feed into the battle as their initial assault force took casualties. The defensive line that had seemed so solid at the beginning was starting to show gaps, places where exhausted defenders struggled to maintain their positions against fresh attackers. "Fall back to the second line," Magnus ordered, recognizing the signs of impending breakthrough. "Controlled withdrawal. Keep your shields up." The Vikings began their retreat toward the hall itself, trading space for time as they had planned. But Halvard could see that even their carefully prepared fallback positions might not be enough to stop the Danish advance indefinitely. The second defensive line crumbled faster than the first, and soon Halvard found himself fighting in the very doorway of his family's hall. Danish warriors pressed forward like a tide of iron and fury, their earlier discipline abandoned in favor of the wild bloodlust that combat inevitably bred. Sven Haraldsson's voice could be heard above the din, shouting orders and encouragement as his men pushed closer to their objective. Inside the hall, Halvard could hear the sound of furniture being overturned as the women and children prepared their final refuge in the root cellars below. Astrid's voice carried clearly as she organized the last-ditch defenses, her healer's calm serving her well in these desperate moments. A Danish spear thrust caught Halvard in the shoulder, the point penetrating his mail and drawing blood before he could bring his shield around to block. The wound burned like fire, but his sword arm remained strong, and Sorrowbiter answered the attack with a devastating cut that opened the spearman's throat. "The roof!" Magnus shouted suddenly, pointing upward where Danish warriors had somehow gained access to the hall's thatch. "They mean to fire the building!" The threat was immediate and deadly. If the Danes succeeded in setting the hall ablaze, everyone inside would be forced into the open, where superior numbers would quickly overwhelm them. The women and children hiding below would be trapped by smoke and flame, faced with the choice between burning alive or emerging to face the mercy of their enemies. Halvard made a decision that would have seemed impossible moments before. Dropping his shield, he seized a throwing axe from the belt of a fallen Viking and hurled it with all his strength at the nearest Dane on the roof. The weapon struck true, sending the would-be arsonist tumbling to the courtyard below, but more enemies were already climbing up to take his place. "Astrid!" he called desperately. "Get everyone to the cellars now!" His sister appeared in the doorway behind him, her face streaked with smoke and her hands bloody from tending to wounded defenders. "The passage is ready," she replied. "But what of you and father?" "We buy you the time you need," Halvard said grimly, turning back to face the renewed Danish assault. But as he raised Sorrowbiter for what might be his final fight, the sound of war horns echoed across the village from the southern approach. These were not Danish horns, but the deep, resonant calls that announced the arrival of Viking reinforcements. Sven Haraldsson's head snapped around at the sound, his confident expression suddenly replaced by uncertainty. He had planned this assault, assuming that Jordvik stood alone, cut off from any possibility of aid. The arrival of unexpected allies would transform a certain victory into a potentially disastrous defeat. "Thorkel the Red!" Magnus shouted with fierce joy as he recognized the banner that appeared at the head of the approaching column. Odin's "Ravens, the king's man has come!" Thorkel's force struck the Danish flank like a hammer blow, his warriors fresh and eager for battle, while Sven's men were already bloodied and tired from their assault on the village. The impact was immediate and devastating, rolling up the Danish line and throwing their careful formations into chaos. Halvard seized the moment of confusion to lead a counterattack from the hall's doorway, his renewed energy carrying him deep into the disordered Danish ranks. Sorrowbiter sang its ancient song of death, cutting down enemies who, moments before, had seemed on the verge of victory. Sven Haraldsson found himself caught between two forces, his carefully planned operation collapsing into a desperate fight for survival. His men were brave and skilled, but they had not expected to face a two-front battle, and their morale cracked under the pressure of suddenly unfavorable odds. "Retreat!" Sven called, recognizing that continued fighting would only result in the complete destruction of his force. Fighting withdrawal to the forest, the Danish warriors began to pull back, covering each other with disciplined skill as they sought to break contact and escape to the relative safety of the tree line. But Thorkel's men were fresh and mounted, perfectly positioned to turn retreat into rout. The pursuit that followed was brief but savage. Danish warriors who had moments before seemed unstoppable found themselves cut down as they fled, their superior numbers meaning nothing in the face of Viking fury and mounted pursuit. Sven himself barely escaped, his magnificent warhorse carrying him to safety, while the bodies of his men littered the ground behind him. As the sounds of battle faded into the distance, Halvard found himself standing in his family's courtyard, surrounded by the dead and dying, his body aching with wounds he had barely noticed during the fighting. The hall still stood, though its walls were scarred and its thatch would need complete replacement. "The message case?" he asked Astrid, as she emerged from the cellars with Alfrid and the other women. "Safe," Elder Bjorn replied, appearing from the temple where he had maintained his vigil throughout the battle. The old gods protected what was placed in their care. Thorkel the Red approached, dismounting from his warhorse with the easy grace of a veteran warrior. His scarred face bore a grim smile as he surveyed the battlefield and the determined defenders who had held their ground against superior odds. "Well fought," he said simply. "King Harald will hear of this day's work, and he will remember those who stood faithful when treachery sought to claim his realm." The immediate danger had passed, but Halvard knew that larger challenges lay ahead. The Danish conspiracy remained active, and enemies who had failed once would surely try again. But for this moment, surrounded by family and allies, he allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and honor maintained. Alfrid approached him hesitantly, her eyes bright with tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Halvard nodded, his hand moving unconsciously to rest on the pommel of Sorrowbiter. The ancient weapon had served his bloodline well this day, and would continue to do so for whatever challenges the future might bring. 6 months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the peaks surrounding Jordvik, Halvard stood once again in the burial field where this story had begun. But this time, he was not alone in his morning vigil. Beside Einar's moss-covered stone knelt a small boy with hair the colour of summer wheat and eyes like sea glass, touched with gold, the unmistakable mark of their bloodline that had proven Elder Bjorn's prophecy true. Young Einar, named for the uncle he would never meet, had been born during the spring thaw, with the distinctive eyes that proclaimed his heritage to any who saw him. Alfrid had endured the birthing with the same quiet courage she had shown throughout the dangerous months that preceded it, and the child had emerged healthy and strong, bearing the physical proof that made all questions of legitimacy forever moot. "Tell him about his father," Alfrid said softly, settling the infant more comfortably in her arms as she joined them beside the grave. The past months had changed her from a frightened young woman into someone who moved with the confidence of one who had found her place in the world. The village had accepted her completely after the battle, recognizing her not as an outsider, but as the mother of their future. Halvard smiled and began the story he had told countless times, watching his nephew's bright eyes track his movements with the intense focus that marked intelligent children. "Your father was a man who believed that courage meant more than skill with weapons," he said, his voice carrying the rhythm of the storytellers who kept Viking legends alive. He believed that the greatest victories were won not through strength alone, but through protecting those who could not protect themselves. The child gurgled contentedly, one small hand reaching toward the wooden wolf that Alfrid still carried, as a reminder of the love that had created this new life. The carving had become a cherished family heirloom, passed from mother to son as a tangible connection to the father who lived on in memory and blood. Magnus approached through the burial stones, moving with the careful gait of a man whose body bore the marks of the battle that had saved their family. His shoulder, wounded in the fighting, would never regain its full strength, but his spirit remained undaunted. At his side walked Astrid, whose skills as a healer had been crucial in tending to the wounded after Thorkel's men had driven off the Danish attackers. "The king's messenger has arrived," Magnus announced, his voice carrying satisfaction mixed with anticipation. "Thorkel brings word, from Harald himself." The message, when it came, exceeded even their highest hopes. King Harald had not merely acknowledged their service in protecting the royal intelligence, he had elevated Magnus to the status of royal thane, granting him lands and privileges that would ensure his family's prosperity for generations to come. More importantly for their immediate circumstances, the king had issued a formal decree recognizing young Einar as a legitimate heir under royal protection, making any future attempts against the child's life tantamount to treason. "There is more," Thorkel added, his scarred face bearing an expression of genuine pleasure. "The intelligence your brother died protecting has proven invaluable. The Danish conspiracy has been exposed and crushed, and the northern alliances remain secure. King Harald specifically requested that I convey his personal gratitude to the family of Einar Magnusson. The recognition meant more than mere royal favor. It meant that Einar's sacrifice had not been in vain, that his death in those distant waters had served a purpose worthy of the songs that would preserve his memory. For a warrior culture that measured a man's worth by the impact of his deeds, this validation was perhaps the greatest honor that could be bestowed. As winter deepened and the long nights returned to the northern lands, life in Jordvik settled into new patterns shaped by the events of the past year. Halvard found himself taking on the role of surrogate father to young Einar while serving as protector and guide to Alfrid. The arrangement felt natural rather than burdensome, a continuation of the bonds that had connected him to his brother in life. Alfrid had adapted to Viking life with remarkable grace. Her merchant's daughter upbringing, providing skills that proved valuable in managing the expanded household that came with their new royal status. Her ability to read and write had made her invaluable in handling the correspondence that flowed from their connection to the king's court, while her gentle nature had won the hearts of the village children who saw her as a second mother. "Do you ever regret it?" Halvard asked her one evening as they sat by the fire, watching young Einar sleep peacefully in his carved wooden cradle. "Leaving the comfort of your father's house for the uncertainties of this life?" Alfrid considered the question seriously before answering. "How can I regret the path that led me to this?" she replied, gesturing toward the sleeping child and the warm hall that surrounded them. "I have gained a family that values honor above comfort, a son who will grow knowing the love of an entire village and the knowledge that I played a part in protecting something larger than my own small concerns." Her father, Gunnar, had eventually reconciled himself to his daughter's choice, though it had taken months of negotiation and the intervention of royal authority to smooth over his wounded pride. The prospect of a grandson with royal protection and noble status had ultimately outweighed his disappointment at the unconventional circumstances of the child's conception. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the village in the pristine white that marked the deep winter season. Inside the hall, the great fire crackled with warmth and light, surrounded by the faces of family and friends whose presence made even the darkest months bearable. Young Einar slept peacefully, unaware that his very existence represented victory over those who would have extinguished his bloodline before it could take root. Halvard rose from his seat and moved to the window that looked out toward the burial field where his brother rested. Though the stones were now hidden beneath snow, he could picture Einar's grave clearly, marked not just by carved runes, but by the living legacy that bore his name and carried his blood into the future. "Sleep well, brother," he whispered to the winter darkness. "Your son is safe, your family is whole, and your name will be remembered with honor." Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and pine, the eternal smell of the northern lands where Vikings had built their lives through courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds of blood and brotherhood.